This program is sponsored by the National Endowment for Humanities. Welcome to the William C. Goodridge Freedom Center and Underground Railroad Museum. Thank you for joining us for our Preserving Voices of Freedom project. The William C. Goodridge Freedom Center and Underground Railroad Museum will host 6 Live and Learn events. These events will engage the community in discussions surrounding culturally relevant and historically significant topics.
Welcome to the William C. Goodridge Freedom Center Underground Railroad Museum. Virtual and live part of a 6-part series for 2022. Good evening. My name is Kelly Summerford, the manager of the William C. Goodridge Freedom Center. This evening is the first 6-part series. Often we wonder about how our lives compare to the lives of our ancestors. This evening, we have Lydia Hamilton Smith, Basil Biggs, to discuss the effects of COVID-19 in racially diverse communities in comparison to the illnesses of the 1800s and early 1900s. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you for being spirited back to visit the museum. It is always a pleasure for William Goodridge's friends to visit his once owned house. William Goodridge was the station master on the Underground Railroad, and this house was used during the Underground Railroad period. William Goodridge was born enslaved in Maryland. His mother worked on the Carroll plantation. Mr. Carroll was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And when she was with child, he sent her to Baltimore. So actually, William Goodridge was born in Baltimore. At the age of 6, he was sent across the Mason and Dixon line to York, Pennsylvania, to live with a Reverend and Mrs. Dunn. Now, many of you know his story. He was set free at the age of 16. He went on to learn barbering, came back to York, and built the tallest and most important emporium in York. He was quite the entrepreneur. But this evening, we want our guests to first introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about who you are. And we'll start with Miss Lydia Hamilton Smith.
Good evening. As Mr. Goodridge has said, that I am Lydia Hamilton Smith. I was born in Gettysburg on the sweetest day of the year, Valentine's Day, and made my way to Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I came here to work for the Honorable Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, starting out as his housekeeper. But he tutored me in the ways of finance, and through that tutelage, I became very good at finance. I owned a home in Gettysburg. I owned 6 homes in Lancaster, and I owned a boarding house in Washington, D.C. So I learned my lessons well. Being his housekeeper initially, I was able to assist those on the Underground Railroad because as his housekeeper, I was able to hire people at my will. People often commented on why they didn't stay long, but they were there long enough to be fed, to be clothed, and to be sent on the road.
Thank you, Miss Smith. It's always a pleasure to have you in the Goodridge home. Now, Mr. Biggs, Basil Biggs, would you tell us a little bit about who you are?
Indeed. Well, it's great to be spirited back and to be amongst my good friends, Miss Lydia Hamilton Smith and Goodridge and others. And, well, I was born in Carroll County, Maryland, April 10th, 1819. And,
another place in Carroll County, you know.
Indeed. So we have close connections, maybe even our genealogy. But my mother died when I was just a 4-year-old lad, and I was sent to live with a Quaker family. And I learned to work with my hands. I learned tanning, and I apprenticed as a veterinarian. And so someone always said I would make my living with my hands. But as I grew older, and I took eyes upon a young lady by the name of Mary Jackson, who were married and had 5 children. When we heard about Thaddeus Stevenson's work with education in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, we went our children because Maryland did not allow for colored children at the time and whites to go together. And so we moved to Gettysburg in the early 1850s. There we established a tenant farming business. But when the Civil War broke out, I took my family to safety to Wrightsville and returned to my home, which had been ransacked by both Union and Confederate soldiers. I petitioned the state to get some of my money, and I did get some of it back, but I was glad to be a part of the Underground Railroad and to use the homes that I lived in as an agent and station master. And so I'm always, again, delighted to be back and to discuss what's going on in the current times.
Thank you, Mr. Biggs. I'd like to remind our audience that they are spirited back, so they know what's going on in our lives today. So let's jump right in. You understand that we have been dealing with COVID-19, which has been devastating for people of our time.
Yes.
So tell me, is there any comparison to COVID-19 and some of the diseases and some of the things that you went through during your time?
Well, indeed, there are some comparisons. One is that we did not choose our melanin content, our skin color. And because of that, we were not given the same privileges. Healthcare was not the same. There was no sense of equity during our time. And in 1833 and 1854, you may be familiar with, I'm sure you are, Mr. Martin Delaney.
Yes.
And the cholera epidemic, which took place all over the country, but particularly in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So he stayed there to work with that. Now, he was a soldier, he was a philosopher, and a physician. But then during the Civil War, it was smallpox. And one writer from the New York Times once said that Confederates and Unions had one common enemy, and that was the smallpox disease. And so, being of a darker hue, I tried to help as many of our people as possible.
Was that because you were also a veterinarian, if I could recall?
Well,
so you had that some form of medical background.
Indeed, I did. I did have some form of medical background, apprenticeship. But the cholera epidemics I spoke to was really referring to Martin Delaney's work. Now, during the Civil War time, it was smallpox, which I'm very familiar with. And some say it came from what they called scabies at the time. But did you know that at least a third of the 600,000 of the soldiers who were killed during the Civil War died of disease?
Yes.
And so again, because as I was burying those Union soldiers, that is not the colored soldiers, but our white counterparts, they were able to be buried into the National Cemetery, whereas the Negro men were not. And so my friends and I, we started the Sons of Goodwill, and we established the Lincoln Cemetery. And so I had to deal with those, and we kept our faces covered as they do today with the COVID. As we went out into the various shallow graves, and I went to Adams, Franklin County, I had been a teamster in Maryland, so I knew how to get a maximum number of bodies on the horse-drawn carts. And so very much a similarity that we had to look out for our own. And I found out, having been spirited back, that the lead researcher and scientist for the Moderna vaccine is a Black woman from the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. Her name is Dr. Kamika Corbett.
Yes.
And so we've always been in the forefront, although we may not be given credit. But it's always a pleasure to see and make comparisons about my day, our day, and what's going on in today's time.
That was very, very interesting, Mr. Biggs, because oftentimes people did not believe we were involved in our own freedom. And when I have people come to the museum, they're surprised that there are so many of you abolitionists that are Black. Now, Ms. Hamilton Smith, do you recall anything that that you would be able to share with our audience that has to deal with the health issues back then and how you would be treated? Because I understand that you would have been of lighter complexion or quadroon. So you would have been treated a little bit different.
Yes, that is true. I was fortunate enough that my circumstances being with a congressman that I would have been given preferential treatment. However, I have found that, as Mr. Biggs stated, our people were given less treatment if they were even had the chance to be hospitalized or taken care of. They were given to the basement and not seen very often at all.
Similar to what people were saying they were treated today.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And one of the things that may have saved us, as it were, that we were segregated. We were pushed aside and therefore may not have contracted as much as those who were white. And we also brought with us from Africa our own herbs and our own methods of healing.
Oh, okay.
And once coming to this country, we had to learn these plants and how they affected our healing.
So there was a holistic,
Yes.
Indeed.
holistic part during your time that this is not new.
No.
Many of our listeners may think that this style of medicine is new. But now that you're telling me that you all were doing that holistic stuff back during your time.
Oh, yes, indeed. And it got to the point where there were many non-whites coming to us for help when they saw the success that we were having with our natural method of healing.
Absolutely. Well, since I have you here, I just need to ask you, have any of you, either of you, become sick during your time? William Goodridge's children, one died very young, and
Indeed.
the other was quite ill. So did you have to personally deal with any illnesses during your time that you can recall?
Well, of the pandemic nature, no. Like I said, I was very fortunate in where I was in my circumstances in life. There were illnesses. As I transitioned into the other life, mine was due to heart conditions. But I'm sure that was because of the work and all that I did through the years. But being in the city of Lancaster, there was sickness, but I was apart from that.
You were born free, if I'm not mistaken.
That is correct, yes.
And were you born free? I don't remember, or were you born enslaved? I think you were born enslaved. I'm not sure.
My mother was free, and so therefore I was free.
Okay.
There. But I wanted to say, just talking about this whole idea of what we brought to this nation. In fact, Martin Delaney, who was more than just a soldier and an officer in the U.S. colored troops, and a physician who actually studied or apprenticed under more than 15 physicians, but he had to submit paperwork to Harvard, and he was accepted there. But his family, his grandfather, was actually from the Gullah area of South Carolina.
Yes.
And that area in particular had many, today they call them naturopaths and herbologists, but we simply knew what plants, leaves to use for external and even internal illnesses. And so that was oftentimes passed on, and I'm sure my mother passed on some things to me as I grew older.
One of the problems that they said with our pandemic here, the COVID-19, was it was affecting the Black communities because many of the African Americans did not trust the science. So what would you say to them?
Well, I think that's understandable. As we've been spirited through the years, we've seen where our people have been used
Yes.
as experiments, and painfully so, and caused many deaths. So yes, there was much distrust. We don't want to go through that again.
Yes, I remember speaking to someone, and they were saying that they would not take the vaccine. Now, what about vaccine? I'm not sure that you had vaccine during your time, but if you had to, let's say, analyze vaccines, and you know what they are, how would you feel about that? I know you believe in the natural way of handling illnesses. So what could you share with our people? And we are not making you authors, and we are not going to have anyone say that Lydia Hamilton Smith and Basil Biggs said not to take the vaccine, because part of me believed that with the science today, you probably would have.
Well, you know, we had science in Africa.
Ah.
And in the, I believe it was late 1700s, early 1800s, there was a tribe in Africa who used vaccines back then. And even, his name escapes me at this moment, but an enslaved person actually talked his master into being vaccinated to save him from illness. So we've been doing this for some time.
Well, indeed, and thank you for reminding us of that, Ms. Smith. And in fact, I can recall one of the helpers, I don't say, I used to say slave, but I say enslaved.
Yes.
So the enslaved helper with the Lewis and Clark expedition named York. And so York helped doctor back his so-called masters at the time. They would have died during their expeditions, but had not been for the knowledge of York during their various trips and expeditions. In fact, I've learned since being spirited back that even Matthew Henson was able to doctor back Admiral Peary in their discovery of the North Pole. If it wasn't for Matthew Henson, Admiral Peary's name would not be written in the history books regarding that. But regarding vaccinations and inoculations, particularly during the Civil War with the smallpox, they initially tried to use healthy children, and they would use an inoculation in their arm and then take that and put it into the children will be inoculated, and they would be sick for a while. And then they would take that and then they would put it into the soldier's arm. Now, the soldiers, they couldn't wait some time for the doctors to come up with a vaccination, so they began to use needles and pins and various things to use to extract from an ill counterpart or comrade. And they would take the scab, and they called that pure science. And they would take that and then try to put it into their own arms. And so there were attempts to have inoculations during the Civil War time, during these smallpox outbreaks.
So it would be safe for me to tell the African American communities that this is not new.
This is not new.
This goes all the way back to the civilian war or before.
That's indeed the way it is.
Now that's a good piece of information that you two are sharing with us, and I'm sure our viewers are a bit surprised too, as am I. The other thing that I was wondering, when the Blacks came to America, as we call it today, there were diseases that they came with.
Yes.
And it's my understanding that there were Native Americans that actually perished because they passed those diseases on. Are you familiar with any of that?
I am, and particularly in communicating with my good friend Martin Delaney, who did a lot of research into sciences and philosophy, and particularly studying what happened in the continent before we were brought here to America. And I would say that Martin Delaney discussed how we were able to find cures before we came to this country. And so the Native American who was here did not have as strong of an immune system, according to what we learned in the history.
Yes,
course.
That's what I heard. Yes.
And so we were able to outlive them in many cases in different parts of these, what we call America, United States of America. They tried to get rid of us, but it was a hard thing to do. I guess we've been blessed and endowed with that strong immune system.
I can speak to some young people today, and they would say the same thing today. So it is amazing how history tends to repeat itself.
Indeed, indeed.
Yes.
And particularly when it comes to African Americans, how they are treated versus their European counterparts. Now, you guys have said, the two of you have told me that you all experience, if it wasn't personal through vision
Yes.
of others, the mistreatment. So I'm going to ask you another fast forward question. What advice would you give the people of the day when they go into hospitals or into their physician's office to some kind of assure that they are being treated equally, if there is such a thing?
My suggestion would be to ask questions, question them. I do not take what they tell you as what they would say as gospel. Because many times they just say, but because they are a physician, they know all, and they do not. Always ask questions.
And there's something spiritual you are saying about that too, that there's someone greater than our physician. Okay.
He is the chief physician. And I would say that we would encourage them to, in this time, get a second opinion, if that's possible, to get us another opinion. And also, since in this time you have so much access to information, to find out for yourself. I can recall talking to someone about an illness that they had, dealing with their heart, and they were given a prescription in the form of a pill by the doctor. And they went home and they researched. And after they had researched, they found out that that particular pill caused bleeding inside their bodies. And so they refused to take that particular pill and went to look for an alternative way of being cured. And so if you have access to information, get all the information that you can about a particular illness or disease.
And get that second opinion if you so think so. And I actually do have a little bit of experience. My sister is a registered nurse.
Yes, sir.
And when she went to Howard's, she was to Freeman's Hospital School of Nursing. And when she was in her science or chemical class, she was telling them about the herbs that my grandma used to tell her to take as a natural antibiotic. And when her professor researched, he found out that those herbs and some of the things that she was telling them, also penicillin,
Yes.
also anti-inflammatories.
Yes.
And
Yes.
they were quite amazed that my sister had all these natural things that my grandmother shared with her prior to going to nursing school. So I do understand what you're saying when it comes to research the medicine as well.
Yes. Yes.
There are three, I understand there are three forms of vaccination for this COVID-19. And people are complaining about, well, there are three. What do you say about that? Can medicine in general come from different places so that three different medicines are not that unusual? Do you know anything about that?
It's not that unusual. In fact, I would say there are more than three vaccinations because some countries have a dedicated vaccination for their country. For example, in the United Kingdom, they established their own vaccination. Russia established its own vaccination, while here in the United States of America, there was Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson. So, but having those vaccinations to cross one another. So if I've taken Moderna, should I take Johnson & Johnson? I would try to stay away from mixing the two if possible and follow what has been prescribed. If you take one, to try to stay with that, because we never know what types of interactions they may have.
So it would be safe for African Americans to not think that is so strange that we have more than one type of vaccine.
And don't forget about much of what is going on in the medical world. I believe they call it Big Pharma.
That's exactly what we call it. Back then during your time, did they have anything that was so political? And I know, Ms. Hamilton, that Hamilton Smith, that Thaddeus was a congressman, and I'm sure he shared a lot of information with you. So was that type of politics going on back during your time?
Oh, there were, if you call them big pharmas in our time, in the mid to late 1800s, trying very hard to, I think the terminology they use is corner the market, and
corner
to
the market.
stop people from their own home remedies. They wanted them, everything was a pill. They wanted them to take these pills or these elixirs. But we have—
Now explain what an elixir is.
that is, they put it in liquid form. They make this.
Oh, okay.
Perhaps Mr. Goodridge would have sold some elixirs in his
You may have.
Oh, I'm sure he did. Oftentimes when I speak with him, he shares a lot of information with me. And yes, he did have those kinds of things that he did sell in his emporium.
Yes.
Of course, you know about his oil of Celsius, which was a bunch of oils that he put together. And it was believed that if you rub it on your bald head, it will make your hair grow. And that's one of the things he shares with me when he spirited that. So yes, of course, he did have those kinds of things.
And one thing, Mr. I would like to talk about, when you spoke of nurses, many times, and I think when we came through that period around World War I, they would not let Black nurses help with the white patients.
Yes.
So they stayed within their own, and they saw a faster healing rate because not only were they using our own remedies, but they were able to use their knowledge in nursing and care to better heal our people. So
Yeah.
they started paying attention to those home remedies at that time.
Yes, I have a lot of nurses in my family, and my aunt that just passed away, she was about 102, and she probably was a nurse longer than most people live. And she did tell me that early on in her career, that whites did not want her to treat them. And I assume, but maybe not, that the same type of things happened when you, I don't know, Ms. Hamilton Smith, I don't want to assume that you cared for Thaddeus when he got sick or any of his nephews, but there's something about being a natural caretaker that my aunt used to say about African Americans.
Well, you know, one of the things that they don't talk about, the Black Moses, Harriet Tubman, is that she had a desire and even established, she called it Home for Indigent Women. Today they may call it nursing home or convalescent homes. But she had established a couple of those, and the AME Church, when in her passing, took up the mantle to continue that work. But health and wellness have been very important in our race and in our culture. And don't forget, as Martin Delaney often talked about, that we were not considered as being even human. We were 3/5, we were less than human. So to think that we could come up with cures. George Washington Carver, of course, not only made products to eat, but he made medicinal products, including oils to help with
Ligaments.
Ligaments.
Yes, I do recall hearing about that.
And even Harriet Tubman, whose father taught her about plant life, she used her knowledge on the Underground Railroad because she would feed, when they had babies, she would feed them. She would make an elixir out of catnip to put the babies to sleep so that they would not cry in an inopportune moment and give away their presence.
You know, because William Goodridge, when he spared it back, he often talked about when children were here or babies were here, they didn't cry.
Yeah.
That's right.
Now, I know Harriet had her remedy,
Yes.
but how did that remedy interact with their spiritual life? Because we also know she was very spiritual.
Well, indeed, they counted on, and we used the term earlier, the chief position. They knew that their lives were in the hands of their creator, the hands of God. And so even in their going back 19 trips, can you imagine? 19 trips from Dorchester County, Maryland, back and forth to New York and to Canada, not on planes and ships as they have today. And she was successful, never being caught, even led raids into Confederate camps. She was the leader. And so that same faith we have today. So couple faith together with the natural remedies that God have already left here for us to use. I think we can do for ourselves if we were left to ourselves.
To our own devices. Well, I absolutely am enjoying this. I hope that our audience are enjoying it. And if there are any questions that are coming by, please let me know to interrupt me so that our guests could answer them. I don't think we have any questions yet, but I am encouraging people. Why you have these two extraordinary abolitionists spirited back, that to correspond with them if you so choose. We don't like to put people on the spot, but sometimes I have to ask those difficult questions when you all are spirited back.
Indeed.
Particularly when you come to my friend William Goodridge's home.
Yes.
Now, talking about the civilian war, talking about the Civil War, many, I understand, Black women helped the soldiers. Someone told me that they used to tear the bottom of their garment and use as bandages.
Mhm.
Now that I have you here, is that true?
Yeah, yes, it is true. There are many aid organizations to help the soldiers, and of course, for our own soldiers who were getting less care, we would do what it took to make sure they were taken care of, and that included taking the material from our undergarments, if you will, and to make sure that they had bandages and were able to be taken care of.
Now that's true sacrifice.
Yeah.
And I leads me into the next question I have for the two of you. What can we do to make our community stronger? Because when I speak to those who were spirited back, although it was difficult for the two of you and many others, you still had some form of commitment, some kind of strength to the communities that you were living in. I know you had a boarding house. Like I said, I know that you did other things that would contribute to your community.
Well, I would say now what we need more so is, in our time, the saying was, it takes a village.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see that strength, that coming together as much now as it was then. You could see someone in the street and a child and correct them on what they were doing wrong. You cannot do that now, it doesn't seem. And we had a trust with one another.
So yeah, that is something, because a lot of times I hear the saying, part of the colonization or part of what was done to us on this land was to make us distrust each other.
Yes.
That distrust is greater than trust. And it took a long time for me to understand that statement. But I found it during my time that distrust is greater than trust. It's harder for us to trust each other and much easier for us to distrust each other. So what you're saying is that there was just a tad bit more trust in the communities because you had to trust each other.
Families were stronger, and stronger families build stronger communities, stronger neighborhoods, and stronger nations. I believe it was Frederick Douglass, if I'm not mistaken, that said it's easier to build back or put the broken pieces back of building a young man back up as opposed to building a nation. And so what I find in these times is that many of us are doing the same things, particularly nonprofit organizations. And but we oftentimes are looking for credit. It's in the basket, I believe. They're looking for credit. And so I know they have these things, what's called, Ms. Smith, social media. And so if I can help someone with food or clothing or something that they need to take care of their family, if I can get my face or name out there, then I would do it. But simply collaborating or getting together with someone who is doing the same thing to help more people, I don't believe it's done as much. In fact, I was talking to some young people the other day, and I asked them a question. I said, do you eat with your family? And many of them said, I eat in my room with themselves and a picture show, a television.
Okay, it's all right. You may call picture shows. They are still picture shows. We have a question. Let me see here. Please elaborate a bit more on how nurses, caregivers of African descent use traditional form of treatment and how they may have been conscripted to benefit others.
Okay, the nurses, as I said, primarily the white patients did not want the Black nurses near them. So they were relegated mostly to their own communities. But thankfully, with their training and with the knowledge from their ancestors, they were able to use these home remedies. There were such oils, just such one thing, oil of oregano. You could take an oregano plant and make an oil that builds the immune system. They could give that to their patients. Again, there's catnip, which is good for stomach ails and other things like that. So they used all of these plants and this home knowledge to make powders or oils to give to their own, to strengthen them.
So our nurses were actually pharmacists too.
Yes, they were.
Indeed, they were.
Yes, they were.
They were indeed pharmacists. And the other things that they were useful for, besides internal and external illnesses, was for mental health. In fact, catnip used that when it's boiled has a calming effect, kind of similar to the oils of oregano. So there was both our grand ancestors knew about these plants that would have a mental health, improve mental health, anxiety, and now we understand you spend quite a few dollars to see someone to ask them what is wrong with you. They call it a clinical psychologist, I believe.
Yes, we have. It is absolutely an area of medicine.
Yes.
Absolutely. And since you mentioned that, because enslavement was horrible, I tell people who visit the museum, it was the worst possible time in America's history,
Yes.
bar none. Now, that in itself had to affect the two of you, seeing that as abolitionists, how did you maintain yours? Because if you're a psychologist or a psychiatrist today, you must have one in order to practice.
Yes. Well, you used the word commitment earlier. So one of the reasons I and my wife were so committed in being agents and conductors on the Underground Railroad, because of much of what we saw. We would see those who we came through our homes who had been further south, and we would oftentimes be able to see their scars, their physical scars on their backs. And so, having seen that, it gave me a strong commitment that I would do all I could do to get them from the south to the north, to some place of freedom. Indeed.
Yes, indeed, and I agree. Helping a young woman to freedom, but consoling her because she lost a child along the way, or she lost another family member along the way. That gave me the strength, and plus that strength from above to continue that work, because how could you leave someone behind? Or how could you not console them? And they had an inner strength, which we fed off of each other. And we had to keep going,
Talking about treatment, and my grandmother was a midwife. And treatment today, even with childbirth,
Yes.
has been noted disparities. That a Black woman is not treated the same in some hospitals as a white woman. And what comes to mind is a very wealthy Black tennis player even talked about it when she had her baby. And I heard that one of the reasons why Black men and women are not given pain medication is because it is believed that Black women do not hurt as much as white women, and Black men do not hurt as much as white men. So elaborate just a little bit on how that came about, and if it was because of slavery that they just believed that we did not have pain. Oh, I know that's touching. That is touching.
I'll begin. And again, I keep calling for the name of Martin Delaney.
Oh yes, Mr. Delaney was wonderful.
Because he was a philosopher and studied the psychology of the dominant race of whites in this country, he understood some of the mythologies that were put out and still have been used in the treatment in many cases. And not only that Black women could endure more pain, but also that we could be useful specimens for the various experiments. I would say that a recent article by the Black Cardiology Association mentioned that African American women and Native American women are 3 times to have a higher mortality rate than white women when it comes to childbirth. And so,
which my grandmother said is the most natural thing on this earth when it comes to medicine. She didn't understand when a specialist.
yes.
She didn't quite understand that. I remember speaking to her when she was somewhere around 93. And she mentioned that now they got specialists for everything.
And I think their strength, again, came from within, because a Black woman in our time had a child, she was forced back out onto the field within hours of giving birth and had to continue to work. So she pulled from within. to go
So
back.
she didn't have that,
There was no.
I got the fevers and
Oh,
I can't work
she
and,
doesn't have the vapors.
and she didn't have the vapors, okay? That was only afforded white women
Yeah.
because of their privilege, correct?
Yeah, yeah.
In fact, I know of one woman who was born in 1914 and had 14 children. Her first child was stillborn, and she had 2 boys, 2 girls, and 9 more boys. And the story goes that she went in to have her baby. She was home in 3 days with a towel on her shoulder, baby on her shoulder, and still cooking and cleaning as if it was yesterday. Through 14 births.
Yes.
And had not gone to hospital until her latter years. So, as your grandmother said, the most natural thing, and was able to endure. I believe there's something about the Black woman, I would say, and what she's been endowed with to deal with both psychologically and physically, not based on myths about enduring pain and inflicting pain, but because she was in the beginning the original woman.
Okay, well, we're going to wrap this up, and I am just so happy that you were able to be spirited back, because sometimes we can't get you. So just a final comment from each of you, and we will wrap this up. And I want the people to understand that we will have this on our website, so you can go back and view at a later date.
Yes.
But just give me a final remark of encouragement, because the one thing that we found out, that post-traumatic slave syndrome exists, and it comes from trauma endured through generations after generations. So just give me like a statement of hope for our people in this pandemic time. COVID-19 has killed many.
Yes.
African Americans, killed many people in general.
Well, I would encourage people not only specifically to look above for their strength, but to come back and start looking to one another again. Let's get this community and family back together again. Start to communicate, because I have in this time walked down your street and spoken to other African Americans, and
Yes.
they don't speak to me.
Wow.
They look at me as though, I don't know you, why are you saying something to me? But I would encourage you, please come back together and bring the family back.
Okay, and Mr. Biggs, your final word.
I would echo that family is essential to maintain the family and to reach back and look up the examples of how we have come through pain. It wasn't easy lying on your back in the slave ship for 3-4 months at a time, but then to come to a new country, still survive, still endure, still participate and make contributions in the sciences, in the arts, in mathematics, in all the various subjects that man could use to better and improve himself. And so although this theme for this year is Black wellness and Black health, in terms of African American history month, from exploitation to excellence, we're certainly standing on the shoulders of many who have been excellent. And we're going to declare that our children shall be excellent and that our families will come back together in this time.
Well, all of us stand on the backs of individuals like the two of you, Basil Biggs, Gettysburg, and Lydia Hamilton Smith, Lancaster. Thank you so much. We appreciate you. And if there are any comments or questions, guess I have to wait till you're spirited back to answer them. But thank you so much. For our viewers, we like to thank Christmas Addicts York. Christmas Addicts York is an African American organization that believes in excellence, just like NEH, who sponsored this, which is the National Endowment for Humanities. And we like to thank them, thank our guests, and we look forward to when we can have live people in our audience. Thank you very much, and good night.